Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 51st episode of the Exploring Anti-natalism podcast, a podcast all about the subject of anti-natalism created by anti-natalists. My name is Amanda Oldfan-Sukanik, formerly known as Federal Films on YouTube, and today I'm speaking with academic researcher and marketing practitioner, editor of the International Journal of Marketing Semiotics, as well as many other publications, including his 2019 paper on the discursive appropriation of the anti-natalist ideology in social media, George Rossolatos. Welcome to the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, Mr. Rossolatos. It's a pleasure to have you here
Hello,
today.
Amanda. Thank you very much for having me. I've watched many episodes, and I think you're doing a fantastic job in promoting an ideology that definitely has taken root and has garnered quite a sizable followership.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that what you're doing is definitely of value, both to researchers as well as to potential members of your community.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. That really means a lot to me. Thank you so much for watching other episodes. That's so awesome. May I call you George for this
Sure,
episode?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
wonderful. Okay, excellent. All right, well, welcome again. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to speak with you today. I have a very clear memory of when the original version of your paper on antinatalism was first released, and I've honestly wanted to talk to you ever since that time, but I wasn't doing a show yet. You're quite a prolific individual, lots of fantastic work around a lot of interesting subjects. And so I was just wondering if we could start out by you telling me a little bit about yourself, who is George Rossolatos, and just a little bit about all your areas of research.
Sure. As you said in the beginning, I'm a marketing practitioner, a branding consultant, as well as an academic researcher. At this point, I'm a postdoctoral researcher and invited lecturer. I'm lecturer on issues of branding, brand communications, cultural consumer research, and new media. These are my three fields of expertise. And the paper on anti-natalism that you read was initially published in the Qualitative report. It's Qualitative research journal across disciplines, and it was republished in revised form in my monograph that's called Interdiscursive Readings in Cultural Consumer Research, that was published by Cambridge Scholar Publishing in 2018. The difference between the two pieces, apart from some minor revisions in the actual text, consists in an appendix where I'm trying to dimensionalize the phenomenon of antinatalism within the context of what I call meta-narratives. What is a meta-narrative? Well, as the term suggests, it's something that comes after meta-narratives. So let's define what is a meta-narrative. The original definition that was furnished by Jean-François Lyotard in his famous or infamous for some book, The Postmodern Condition, which kick-started, at least officially, the postmodern movement, regardless, of course, of any precedents in different artistic movements such as surrealism and Dadaism and so on and so forth, was the fact that Jean-François Lyotard envisioned a shift away from totalizing discourses, that is, grand narratives in the vein of traditional philosophical systems, as well as theological doctrines, which have been dominating Western thinking up until that point. And the way out as an exit of this meta-narrative regime, let it be called regime, was to legitimate other forms of discourse, such as those that pertain to art and that have an artistic underpinning, rather than those that take their lead from rational argumentation or philosophical systematic thinking, as known to us up until now. So the exit from the state of meta-narratives was a liberation of human expressive forms, as well as a liberation of art as, a side dish of traditional philosophical theorizing. Of course, down the line, as it turned out, this has been used by certain social forces or interest groups in a sense for liquidating at the beginning and let's say during the first phase existing notions and perceptions about what constitutes legitimate thinking in order to reinstate systems, totalizing systems that had been superseded even before the advent of postmodernity, that is, at the stage where modernity in the 18th century tried to release humanity from the yoke of religious doctrine. And we're talking about religious doctrine here quite emphatically, because at the very bottom of the social forces, at least to my understanding and to my cultural perception, these are the very dominant forces that have been parasitically feeding on this destabilization that was brought about by postmodernity. Of course, that had nothing to do with the original intention of Lyotard, but this is a typical case of how different power groups and different dominant structures appropriate ideologies to their own ends in order to legitimate their own agendas. And of course, in a matter that has nothing to do with the original intention of the authors that put forward either philosophical systems or artistic manifestos or other forms of thinking to this end. So the meta-meta narrative is a predicament where we experience the comeback of big grand thinking in the style of Immanuel Kant's first critique, or Hegel's logic or phenomenology of spirit, where they're trying to encapsulate the entire meaning of being human and what it means to know and what it means to feel and to think. That is the first critique of Kant. That was the epistemological work that was succeeded by his practical philosophy, and then the critique of judgment by this aesthetic philosophy. So, but these were all couched in totalizing terms, which is very definitive and very of major philosophical systems. That is a set of major and minor premises which self-referentially constitute a closed totality wherein the meaning or the entire meaning of existence is supposed to be conveyed. And the same holds, of course, for religious doctrine, which is in more parabolic terms and in more allegorical and metaphorical terms, without, of course, implying that philosophical systems, as Derrida has amply demonstrated, are not also predicated of rhetorical tropes. This has been amply scrutinized ever since the Derrida's pinpointing of dominant metaphors and dominant themes that have been permeating Western philosophy ever since its inception with the pre-Socratics and onwards and up until Heidegger. So yes, this totalizing form of thinking, and in an attempt to answer fundamental questions about human existence, to my understanding, has been revived with Benatar's anti-natalist philosophy.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for all of that. Actually, that whole explanation helps me already just understand your paper so much clearer and your intentions. You'll have to forgive my ignorance. The term semiotics was not a term that I was familiar with before I read your paper. Can you tell me a little bit about, just in general, what semiotics mean, and how was your paper a study of antinatalism through semiotics, or is that a bit tangential to what the intention was?
Actually, in this paper, I'm not following a semiotic analytical route. I'm following a discourse analytic route, and more specifically, I'm applying Ruth Kodak's discourse historical analytical perspective in the analysis of the empirical data that have been sourced from the Anti-natalism Facebook community. So it's not semiotic per se. is discourse analytic. These are two sister disciplines in many respects, and for the sake of outlining some similarities in terms of their historical evolution, they're in major perspectives in discourse analysis, such as Fairclough's CDA, critical discourse analysis, is drawing amply on Halliday's systemic functional linguistics, which is also the main source behind social semiotics. At the same time, social semiotics have been gravely influenced by Helmslev's semiotic perspective, the famous Danish semiotician who drew a distinction between, in terms of meaning generation, between forms of expression and the matter of expression in a fourfold theoretical perspective, and between the form of Helmslev was a major inspiration between Greimas, who marked a radical departure from traditional French Saussurian sign-based semiotics. So there are, common parts between discourse analytic perspectives and semiotic perspectives. At the same time, Ruth Kodak's, for example, historical discourse analytic perspective draws on Parisian semiotics, which is a major part, and other, methodological and conceptual cross-pollinations, which I will be laying out quite explicitly and vividly in the introduction to a forthcoming collective volume that is called Advances in Marketing in Brand Semiotics and Discourse Analysis, that is due to be published by Vernon Press this year.
Amazing. So, congratulations on that. That's excellent.
So hopefully in a few months' time, or by the end of the year, you'll have the opportunity, and I will alert you as soon as it's available, to identify, the various respects and ways whereby these two disciplines, grosso modo, intersperse, both conceptually and in terms of methodological outlets.
Fantastic.
So,
love that.
Pursuant to this, let's say, introductory parenthetical explanatory detour, let me return to an attempt at addressing your original question. That is, my paper is drawing on critical discourse analysis in order to identify primarily what sort of discursive strategies are used by members of the anti-natalist movement while negotiating the basic tenets of the original philosophy, as well as what kind of interaction patterns are formed online in the formation of collective identity against the background of the main tenets of anti-natalism as an ideology and philosophical system, as well as what kind of dominant tropes, rhetorically speaking, are evinced while trying again to appropriate, to make one's own an ideology that is quite abstract and bring it to one's own measure.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for that. I can't wait to get into depth talking about the paper. Before we get to that, two other quick questions. I'd love to ask you, George, why are you or are you not an anti-natalist?
Well, definitely not an anti-natalist as regards the ism part, but I can definitely at the same time sympathize with the drivers and the antecedents that may cause someone to become an anti-natalism, which of course are definitely all around us, especially during the past 2 years, and the COVID phenomenon. I'm sure that this public sentiment will become, and is due to become, more widespread. However, from let's say philosophical point of view, I wouldn't be inclined to endorse anti-natalism. for the first of all, because I'm not particularly attracted to any isms. I'm much more, let's say, um, inclined to adopt a critical perspective or a postmodernist or a deconstructive attitude towards sociocultural phenomena rather than uncritically endorse isms, especially due to the fact that such meta-narratives by now should have evaporated rather than, making a comeback, especially as in entrenched fashion as are put occasionally forward by their originators. So in principle, I'm not an anti-natalist. However, I can definitely sympathize with anti-natalists as regards some aspects of the philosophical movement.
Oh, completely fair. Okay, thank you so much for your answer on that. How did you originally become interested, though, in the subject of antinatalism? And I'm also curious, when did you originally engage with Benatar's work for the first time?
Mm-hmm. I was particularly drawn, well, first of all, due to my broader interest that's called cultural consumer research. I'm always trying to identify innovative subjects or under-researched subjects which I can potentially explore and expand or initiate. For example, I wrote the first semiotically inclined paper on the Ice Bucket Challenge. The Ice Bucket Challenge. Yes, that was one of the first paper, well, actually the very first paper that was written in terms of viral communications and the notion of virality and what this means culturally, given the fact that so many prominent cultural intermediaries were involved in this phenomenon, from famous actors to politicians, what this means for the cultural order, especially given that it is something that is passed along below the radar of verbal reasoning. So it's a purely, viral phenomenon that takes place at an embodied level. And this is definitely something that triggered my researcher interest. And I was particularly glad because it's one of my most cited papers as well. So apart from that, I've written on various topics. For example, what is the meaning of seduction, a semiotic account of seduction, by expanding Baudrillard's account from his book on seduction. I recently wrote two papers, one paper and one chapter about mass shootings, where I'm putting forward a perspective where, again, I'm tracing the origins of mass shooting, of the phenomenon of mass shootings, to a very fundamental yet absent conditional of communitarian organizing. It's what I call the will to be traumatized, drawing on theories of collective traumatism and other psychoanalytic concepts. I'm also putting forward some new concepts, for example, something about ipseity, which I don't remember right now, far too many concepts. And in order to explain the phenomenon of mass shooting beyond the cognitivist, the stringent and very strict boundaries of cognitivist or psychological and even more so psychiatric explanations, so to speak. So that was another aspect that of mass shootings that drove my attention to this prominent, most unfortunate, but at the same time, what I'm calling it's a phenomenon of necessary violence. It's what Derrida calls transcendental violence. It's a necessary phenomenon for sustaining a community as such, and of course for repeating. It's an act that must be repeated in order for a community to be sustained as such, and it's something from a Christological point of view, Girard's Christological point of view, that has direct lineage with the figure of Christ as regards the sacrificial victim upon whose death a community is edified. And again, in another chapter on the same topic, I'm expanding the murderous as well as cannibalistic fundamentals of Christianity. rather than agapitic religion. That's another part and another topic that I researched recently. Another topic was vibrators. Again, I've never used a vibrator, but it's such a ubiquitous and high penetration phenomenon. Well, in terms of population penetration, of course, I've read that around 60% of women actually answered in the survey that they have used at least once a vibrator in their lives. So from marketeer, this just triggered my imagination and my research interest, saying that if there's such high penetration rate, how come there's no established research field for this category? And what I found by looking at the promotional texts of vibrators, which was again by adopting a discourse analytic point of view, which was my primary field of interest, was that where Foucault was calling the technologies of self and how technoscientific regimes attain to encapsulate even fundamental instincts and even fundamental ways of reproducing such as intercourse, especially in a post-humanist predicament, is 100% reflected in the promotional text of this particular product category, which I think is a fantastic finding. And you can modulate the vibrator in the same manner as you can fly an airplane in order to attain different levels of pleasure, which again is the imposition of a techno-scientific regime in a field that was considered either taboo or inscrutable or invested with theological connotations. For example, the inscrutability or the mystery of reproduction. This is a very remarkable way of how a post-humanist predicament has demystified what used to be considered as an avaton, that is, something that meant to transgress or gain knowledge into its secret machinations. So, from a cultural point of view and a cultural analytic point of view, all these topics, including anti-natalism, of course, are of massive interest, and they're of massive interest, and especially with anti-natalism, I think that there are even more important reasons for why one should be driven, at least out of curiosity, to scrutinize its fundamental tenets. Is that we live, in an era where, as Bernardo rightly said, suffering is definitely all around us in perhaps more penetrating ways than it has been in other eras. And of course, the ubiquity of mass media and the accessibility to mass media everywhere and at any point has definitely contributed to the catapulting of suffering into a mainstream theme. So there's always a way of transforming an objective fact in a commonplace rhetorically through the images that are made through the media. But in any case, it's of great interest, even more of greater interest, to scrutinize how in a philosophical system, I don't think it's a philosophical system, but let's call it philosophical system to begin with, we can come back to this later, is transformed into an ideology that is a set of fuzzy schemata. And third, the third point of transformation, how this ideology is a set of fuzzy schemata gives rise through appropriation to empirical instantiations and appropriations, which is how ideology works. It needs subjects in order to gain root, and subjects need an ideology in order to justify aspects of their existence which they cannot, to which they cannot provide answers in different manners. So let's say it's this tripartite process that drove me particularly to antinatalism, because in a post-meta-narrative or wannabe post-meta-narrative regime, one would not expect to come across an entire philosophical system that inspires an ideology and a social movement. That's why I'm drawing parallels with the Communist Manifesto, because at least to my knowledge, that was the last piece of philosophical writing that inspired an ideology which was transformed into a socio-political movement. So, given the the time, the time different the time lag between the Communist Manifesto and the Anti-natalist Manifesto, it's a fantastic opportunity to explore this tripartite process, and even more so in a predicament where nowadays we have the opportunity to actually explore, thanks to social media, how an ideology becomes part of subjects' ordinary existence through interaction, by observing the interaction in situ, which is something that we didn't have the opportunity as social scientists to do in different eras. For example, back in the time of the October Revolution, there were no means, like cameras or drones that could possibly, take actual footage of everyone who's participating in a demonstration, or the dialogues that are enacted between them. This kind of opportunity we have in the context of social media. So it's one more reason why this is a very interesting phenomenon that merits excessive scrutiny.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all. What a fascinating road into this subject. I mean, let me ask this, and I fully admit perhaps I'm misunderstanding, but is what you're saying basically that a philosophical text then becoming an ideology, which I will talk more about later. I believe it's a bit debatable whether antinatalism is an ideology, but you're saying that that's a bit of an anachronism, that that's like something that shouldn't be happening basically anymore due to social changes. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying it's something that would not be expected to be
I
happening,
see. Yeah.
because grand philosophical systems have given largely their place to what is called lifestyle ideologies, as I'm describing in the preamble to my paper on antinatalism. For example, veganism, slow food movement, or Occupy Wall Street, especially more lifestyle-oriented ideologies, or more ephemeral ideologies, which have a very quick learning curve, and they burned out pretty quickly. So within this predicament, post-ideological predicament, so to speak, I wouldn't expect a full-fledged philosophical system to emerge that is laying claim to providing the ultimate truth about human existence, which was the mode of writing and the mission and the objective of meta-narratives from other eras. So, and again, it's an exception. Haven't, at least to my knowledge, and of course it's constrained because I'm a finite being. There might be other meta narratives out there of which I'm not aware, and I would really, love it if people actually drop me an email and say, you might as well, look into this meta narrative as well. I'd be really glad to do so. But again, to my knowledge, I haven't come across any other full-fledged philosophical perspective, contemporary, that's laying claim, to providing the answer about human existence.
Amazing. Yeah, no. I also thought that I read your paper a number of times, and that is one of the questions that most came to mind. Is like, well, is there anything else like this basically happening? No, amazing theory. Really a fascinating theory. I really think you are the first to kind of theorize in this way about antinatalism. So I'd love to, begin our more proper discussion of the paper itself. I've got a bit of a preamble just for some of this you've already
Sure.
said, but for the benefit of those listening that perhaps haven't read the paper. So on Halloween, October 31st, 2017, you released a work that, if I'm not mistaken, was as you said, though, as you did clarify earlier, was the first iteration of the paper that would later become On the Discursive Appropriation of the Antinatalist Ideology in Social Media. And that paper was called Consuming Antinatalism in Social Media, a discourse historical analytic approach. This paper is a study of what was then, and still to the best of my knowledge, is the largest antinatalist Facebook group in English. There are, in fact, several much, much larger antinatalist Facebook groups in other parts of the world. There's a very, very large Facebook group entirely in Arabic. There's another one that's entirely in Portuguese that has over 100,000 members. By comparison, actually, this Facebook group is quite small. This group was originally created on September 7th, 2007. The group is an incredible 14 years old now. At the time of writing your paper, you quoted the membership of the group to be 5,000 members. Today, it has actually doubled that number to 10,000, which is really quite incredible over just a couple of years. What originally led you to studying the antinatalist Facebook? This antinatalist Facebook community specifically? As I'm sure you know, there are many other, even besides the ones in other languages, many other ones in English, and there's also many communities across many other platforms for antinatalism, like Reddit, YouTube. So why Facebook specifically?
Well, on the other hand, YouTube is the only medium where actual interaction takes place among members of communities. Which is not the case with YouTube, which tends to be, a string of monological comments. So you don't have the opportunity to examine, as a new media researcher, the interaction patterns that take place, the interaction patterns between members. This, as regards the platform, the choice of platform, as regards the choice of community within that platform, at least to my knowledge, back when originally composed this paper, that was the largest community in Facebook, English-speaking community, and with global membership as well, at least based on my research. So it was a matter of numbers. And as you very well put it in your introduction to this community, it's the one with the greatest longevity. It was established in 2007, which means that there was a maturity, as I perceive it, 11 years down the line, the community had been endowed with a sense of maturity as regards the way they're tackling the philosophical and ideological aspects of Bernardo's system, which of course was identified by pinpointing specific members who were long-term members, and try to see to what extent their comments, the content of the comments had, gone through changes between the years. For example, and I was particularly, impressed, to find that against my, let's say, original background assumptions, that some of these members, they were very knowledgeable of the actual philosophical argumentation of Bernardo, rather than regurgitating in a decontextualized ideological fashion some of the premises that are contained therein. So, all these aspects are very important, for forming a well-rounded perspective about how the original philosophical perspective transmogrifies into an ideology, and then how this ideologically fuels and is inscribed in actual behavior that deploys in situ.
Okay, thank you. It's a fascinating comment that you made about YouTube specifically, because so I first came to this community in 2010, and I came to it through YouTube. And at the time, YouTube was structured in a way that really allowed people to communicate with each other in a way that's really kind of non-existent now on YouTube, where you could make, response videos back and forth to each other, and they would be attached underneath the video. And there was a real debate culture, and there was a real sort of more interpersonal kind of world that was created. But all of that has been wiped away. So many of those videos are gone. So I wonder if, like, if we could go back in time, I do believe you could probably do a similar study of the community at that time. But it was so fragile. I said this a little bit before, but I do think it really does deserve to be pointed out that this paper was, as far as I know, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, examples of somebody actually taking the time to do an academic study of the antinatalist community. There have been a few since. There's the work of Faith L. Brown. I'm not sure if you got a chance to listen to her episode on the podcast. She does some incredibly fascinating work. But I really do think you might be the first. So congratulations on that. It
was definitely the first one. Because I researched the entire academic different databases, and there was no account of the actual Facebook community or any other social medium until then. So I'm really glad that I did this at that point, and it has been cited quite extensively ever since by scholars who have been interested in how ideologies form in new media. But again, I think there's massive potential going forward for extending both the focus of this research as well as the different social media, as you rightly said, were anti-natalism is currently a major topic of discussion.
I think so too. I think there's huge areas to move forward with all of this. Can you tell me a little bit about the kind of papers that it's been cited in, or how it's been used since its publication?
Not on top of my head, because
that's okay. Yeah.
I haven't looked at it for quite some time. I tend to cite different research pieces that have cited my work on a page in my blog, Disruptive Semiotics.
Okay.
But I haven't renewed it for a while, because I've been quite busy with my forthcoming book, the one I'm editing. So that has been consuming quite a lot of my time lately.
Right, of course, absolutely. Yeah, well, once again, I'm very grateful that you jumped in and started this whole inquiry into sort of what's going on in these groups. I mean, you have answered this a bit already, but I mean, how did all of this? How did your work start with this research? I mean, what was sort of the first steps? Did you communicate directly with people in the community? Were you, did you make yourself known within the community that you were doing this work? Did you talk to the moderators with information, or were you really sort of a silent observer? I've been very curious about that.
Well, as I'm explaining my paper in the methodology section, I adopted a netographic approach, which is the marketing research equivalent of digital ethnography, that is well known in digital anthropological circles. I adopted a non-participant observation route, that is, I did not interact directly with the members. I just observed as a impartial and let's say non-visible participant the actual interactions and the content, and this is why I didn't want to take any I didn't want to infuse any bias by taking any positions, which is a methodological principle of ethnographic principle for conducting non-participant observation, either in physical settings or in online settings. So I try to be as impartially present as possible in order not to infuse any bias in the data.
Okay, excellent. If it's all right with you, may I read the abstract from the paper? Okay.
Definitely, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Anti-natalism, a relatively recent moral philosophical perspective and ideology that avows it is better never to have existed, has spawned a social movement with an active presence in social media. This study draws on the discourse historical approach (DHA) to critical discourse analysis for offering a firm understanding as to how the collective identity of the Facebook anti-natalist NSM, which is New Social Movement, is formed. The findings from the analysis of the situated interactions among the NSM's members demonstrate that collective identity is far from a nitty-gritty concept, but a dynamic schema that includes a plethora of micro-interactions. Individuals constantly negotiates its meaning in context as they seek to streamline the antinatalist system of ideas with their life world through a web of interlocking schemata, discursive and rhetorical strategies. So first off, may I ask, for the sake of our viewers who have not read the paper, can you go into a little bit more depth about what exactly the discourse historical approach is? And could you perhaps go into a bit more detailed about how exactly it was applied to the study and how it was used to collect data?
The discourse historical approach is a discourse analytic perspective that was coined by Ruth Wodak and Martin Reisegel. They're two well-known discourse analytic researchers and authors. And the basic principles are that you adopt a historical perspective when scrutinizing a sociocultural phenomenon, meaning that you're trying to not just analyze the data as they're presently involved in the interaction of participants, but you're trying to introduce a historical evolution of a movement in order to contextualize it as neatly as possible within a broader sociocultural framework. And this is what I try to do by embedding the anti-natalist movement within the rationale of meta-narratives and what I term as meta-meta-narrative. I'm trying to place this ideology and philosophical system within a broader sociocultural predicament and what it means nowadays for people to be involved within a philosophical movement and an ideology that springs from it. The second part that is definitive of DHA is close attentiveness to situated interaction among participants, how the actual dialogues take place, what kind of lexicogrammatical resources are mobilized and used by its participants while interacting, for example, and especially as regards the rhetorical aspects. For example, what kind of metaphors they're using, what other tropes they're using, visual and verbal. And the third part consists of trying to identify discourse strategies that are used when framing and tackling sociocultural phenomenon. That is, what kind of permeating modes of thinking the participants mobilize in order to make sense of their predicament. And this is why in the 5 discourse strategies that are identified by cross-referring to other discourse analytic studies, such as the discourse strategy of appropriation, changing the subject, yes, this sort of discourse strategies, they're quite ubiquitous in how the members try to make sense of this philosophy and adapt it to their own. And this is my cat's tail.
So sweet. Oh, hello.
And here's the actual cat. Say hello.
Hello, sweetheart. Oh, what a beautiful kitty.
Appropriation, for example, it's a discourse strategy that was originally coined by Fairclough in 1995, and it designates individual attempts to own the ideology, that is, to appropriate it within the phenomenological reality of one's own life world by appealing to individual life experiences. This is one of the key strategies that are employed, at least according to my analysis, by the members of the Anti-natalist movement, in an attempt, for example, they were referring to their cousins, to the siblings, to their sons, to mothers, daughters, blah, 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 what kind of operations they went through, what kind of unfortunate events that had been experienced, which drove them to, become attracted to the antinatalism movement. So again, this is a way of trying to pinpoint all these different transformations and transmogrifications take place between the three strata: philosophical movement, ideology, and empirical reality. How these three aspects interrelate, and how one is transformed to another. The discursive strategy, let's say, is the nodal point that links ideology and empirical reality. Another prominent strategy that was found to be amply operative in this community was a change of subject that was defined by Hanson in 2015 to be realized mainly in two ways: via topic control or by manipulative strategy of making use of recipients' vulnerabilities. People tend to shift between subjects. For example, while talking about abortion, they tend to jump onto some other equally, let's say, sensitive phenomenon that might be accommodated within the same ideology as put forward by the Anti-natalist manifesto. So again, it's an attempt, to create effervescence, which is a precondition for creating collective identity by changing subjects, which can homologically point to the same underlying ideologism, as criterion for subsumption under a specific principle of Benadryl's philosophical system. It's all these nodal points that are very important in identifying how the actual empirical reality of situated actors reflects the philosophy and the ideology, and how this fuzziness consolidates through effervescence and emotional co-belonging, because these communities are called, they're both imaginary, as Anderson said, as well as affective communities. There's an underlying effect, or there are some, there's a lot of disgruntlement, there are a lot of negative emotions, adverse emotions, experiences that each one is trying to intermingle with one another against the background of perhaps different experiences, albeit which may effervescently constitute a sense of communitas, a sense of community. So it's very important to see how this change of subjects and this what's called in the pragmatics and shifters, what kind of shifters are used when changing subjects, which tend to differ from oral discourse and oral interaction. Again, a massive difference between between social media discourse and in vivo discourse, where these shifters sometimes tend to be absent. It's particularly important to know which shifters are absent by comparing and contrasting with studies in pragmatics that have been conducted in physical settings, as well as what kind of shifters tend to replace these shifters that are present in oral discourse. Generally speaking, social media discourse is considered to be closer to written discourse rather than oral discourse. This is why the concept of interaction has been challenged in the computer-mediated discourse analytic literature, because it's more like an interaction between monological subjects that takes place not necessarily in the same spatio-temporal, in the same spatio-temporal contours, meaning that you can interact with a comment that was posted 2 years ago, which challenges the simultaneity of discourse that is a necessary condition for interaction in physical space. Or there might be a special lag, meaning that the one social actor may be situated in a completely different context when interacting with a comment, rather than be co-present, for example, in the same place, which is definitive of interaction in physical places. So there's different aspects of interacting in social media play a major role, they perform a major role in what sort of interaction, in how interaction enables the consolidation of a sense of collective identity, which is a collective identity that say is produced through different time lags, through different special predicaments, and is not necessarily streamlined or compressedly produced, as the case with live demonstrations or with in vivo meetings between the members of a community. Again, these are perhaps more academic and more nuanced aspects that are nevertheless very important in
Absolutely.
understanding how an ideology shapes in social media, and what kind of ideology is this compared to lifestyle ideologies, how it evolves through time, what kind of resources are employed, linguistic and multimodal, for example, videos, pictures, and other paraphernalia and cultural artifacts that are amenable to producing collective effervescence and a collective sense of identity.
Excellent, excellent. A quote from the paper that I think, in my mind anyway, sums up your intentions very well. The offered analysis focuses on how the collective identity of the Facebook antinatalist NSMs emerged through an ongoing negotiation of the meaning of this ideology in members' online interactions. It is this as you call it, negotiation of the meaning of antinatalism that is of great interest to me, and I think is a subtext to this podcast that's been sort of all consuming, where I think that the negotiation of what antinatalism means is it permeates all antinatalist spaces. It's not just in this Facebook group. And I think that antinatalism means, there's a kernel of an idea that we all have, but what it is changes from person to person, really quite dramatically. I mean, antinatalists believe antinatalism to be very dramatically different things from one another. And that's been a huge point of interest in my own research on the topic. In your opinion, are antinatalists negotiating the meaning of our philosophical position in a way that is unusual to how other social movements might be doing so?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure whether it's different to other social movements, especially lifestyle movements, which then again to incorporate quite vividly aspects of discourse strategy of individuation or appropriation. This is definitely a permeating strategy across lifestyle movements. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's different,
Okay.
but it's definitely unique in terms of, as you said, to what extent these differences grapple with the philosophical positions or with a fuzzy concept, ideologically transmogrified, of antinatalism. That is a fuzzy schema of elliptical principles, as has been framed, for example, by Eagleton. As Eagleton said, on the one hand, ideologies are passionate, rhetorical, impelled by some benighted pseudo-religious faith. On the other hand, there are arid conceptual systems which seek to reconstruct society from the ground up in accordance with some bloodless blueprint. And another important citation for understanding how ideologies work by Vodak. Ideologies are defined as perceptions and opinions about the social and political realities of societies, which aim at truths and generalizations, although they might also contain untruths, half-truths, or unfinished systems of thoughts and beliefs. So it's, there's a lot of confusion. This is what they're called fuzzy schemata. What is a schema? Rather than a concrete representation, an example to understand how the difference between a schema and a concrete empirical representation is to think of the difference between an office space and a chair. When I'm referring to a chair, we have more or less a more concrete grasp of that object that is that's called chair. When we say office, we have a more abstract representation. For example, for some, they might include a PC, a desk, a chair, perhaps a plant, a picture, and some of these subordinate concepts, they're more central to the formation of the abstract concept, schematic concept of office, whereas others are more peripheral. This is not the case with chair. So if you multiply this abstract schematic concept of office to the nth dimension, you can understand where concepts such as anti-natalism or God or other such abstractions, how they become consolidated and solidified as representations through, all sorts of different kinds of pictures, lexemes, elliptical sentences, and representations. We send different idiosyncratically among the linguistic subjects that are their carriers. In the same fashion, the actual matter of the discussions that's taking place in most of these communities, it tends to be ideologically elaborated rather than philosophical argumentatively oriented. This is why it's not as critical as they tend to endorse, the premises while they contextualize these premises from the actual argumentative contours that spawn them. That's the difference between ideology and a philosophical system. When you're engaging in philosophical discussion or when you're trying to criticize a philosophical system or part of a system, usually you tend to examine, fundamental aspects such as whether it includes internal contradictions between earlier parts of the exposition and later parts, whether there are terminological inconsistencies, whether it deviates from previous philosophical positions and in what respects. So this is a matter of, reading philosophical text. Whereas when you're employing the premises that have been produced through a philosophical text in an ideological manner, you unhinge them from the philosophical contours and you use them acontextually and more often than not in an emotively laden manner that's trying to give expression to deeply held emotions or disgruntlements rather than reflect the actual meaning of the premises that stems from the original text. That's the difference between ideology and the original philosophy. Of course, as is well known, the same happens with what happened with the Communist Manifesto. The way it was. To be honest, I've never read it, so I'm not going to go into depth about it, and I'm not a communist either. But I have to say this because this is what it's a commonplace that the manifesto itself, in its philosophical exposition, is far removed from the way it was negotiated ideologically and how it gave rise to an entire state that was founded upon its premises. But it's a typical case, and it shows very vividly in Benatar's case as well. To give you another example, and this is something that I'm not sure whether it has been mentioned in any by any of your previous invitees, but it's definitely a very important aspect in terms of philosophical precedents. Benatar's system is not new.
Right. Yes.
The same thesis was developed by both Schopenhauer, who has been graded by as the first philosopher of suicide by many, and Nietzsche, of course, who's, for people who study philosophy and first degrees was philosophy, with an orientation towards continental philosophy, that is Nietzschean, Freudian, Derridian, blah blah, post-structuralism. That was one of my favorite, topics. And I'm obviously I'm still using my all this knowledge that I have gained through different phases in my academic research, and I have deepened in various areas. But I was particularly drawn to continental philosophy because it's the only way to create bridges between sociocultural phenomena and the accounts about this phenomena rather than analytical philosophy is more like sentence-oriented, which is not very reflective of actual discourse. There's a massive difference. So, to cut a long story short, Schopenhauer will is a fundamental aspect of human existence, and it's not subject dependent. It's something for, let's say, a cosmic will, and it's something that works by itself and in itself. It animates, humans. It's not something that is consciously motivated by humans, which stands a difference from, for example, cognitive psychological accounts of subject, the human subject being a goal-oriented subject in the first place, fundamentally. That was not the case with Schopenhauer. So this explains in various respects why desire is always incitable and why you can never this meets in certain respects also Bernardo's claim and premise that however happy you think someone is, no one is happy, fully happy, because this is a fundamental law of desire. It rekindles itself by itself, and you can never, say that okay, I fulfill my desire, because it's the very essence of desire to be rekindled. So Schopenhauer's way out of this would be either to commit suicide or to distance oneself from, this view of subjectivity as a desiring mechanism, as Deleuze would say, through what Nietzsche said, the term is the ascetic ideal, that is the ideal of Christianity, that is go out of the desert and speculate all alone about divinity or whatever else must spring your mind in the desert. Most likely that you're out of food and water. But anyways, for some of it may be an ascetic ideal. Not for me, but whatever. That was Nietzsche's original conception. And yes, through distancing from the vagaries that plague human existence, we might become more self-conscious about the fact that we're never free from desire, and that desire, because it's so overwhelming, the only way to satiate it would be to end our lives, which pretty much consolidates in a crude fashion Schopenhauer's position. Of course, there are the other ways of reading the term suffering that Bernardo is using for this human condition, which to my understanding is, and also wrote this in my paper on Anti-natalist, is very close to the originary scene and to the fall of man, the Christian notion of the fall of man from a paradisial space, utopian space. It's not, Bernardo is not using a physiological term like pain. There's a massive difference between pain and suffering. Suffering is an emotionally elaborated term of that refers to an underlying condition, but it's a psychological inner elaboration of a stimulus. It's not a stimulus as such. So, for example, when you're saying that there's this person's in pain because he has lost a leg, you don't sympathize with his pain. You sympathize with the expression of his pain, which is psychological elaboration of the pain, and which is called suffering. So, if the fundamental condition, according to Christianity, is to suffer because you have, fallen from a originary condition of fullness, utopian condition of fullness, then definitely the only way out would be to seize your life or to never have come into life, because life is a priori and conditioned to be suffering. So, to my understanding, Bernardo is a very good Christian and a very devout Christian as well. Very devout Christian, just like Schopenhauer in certain respects, although, his works have been read through Hinduism and Buddhist philosophy, is definitely a very good Christian as well, an apologetic for suicide, which is the only way of, putting an end to a preconditioning suffering that is part and parcel of accepting this doctrine.
Well, I would have to. There's so much to unpack there. I don't know that we'll get to all of it, but I mean, I think the point is to prevent the existence of more of it. There's no mandate to then go kill yourself. I don't think that that's the prescription at all. Really, it's that just stop creating more babies. Basically, I mean, that's the anti-natalist conclusion. You're not under some. It's really not about ending your own suffering. It's doing something to prevent the existence of more of it.
Well, if you put it this way, I mean, Bernardo is actually more insistent that when he's talking about ending one suffering, or about it would have been better if we had never been born, he's including his own existence as well.
Sure,
so
that's true, but I think it has more to do with, he's trying to prevent the Benatars of the future, so to speak. I mean, he can. I mean, I am also a right to die advocate. I believe, and Benatar is as well. I mean, I certainly think both of us would agree that people should have the right to end their existences at the time of their choosing. So that's a whole separate topic. But I think that the where he's trying to get people to go is to not procreate. It comes back to procreation, not suicide. So yeah.
Philosophically and sophistically, rather, it's very easy to sophistically reverse this argument and bring it back to its head. Because when someone says it's better to have never been born, and if one includes one's own existence, then it leads, these two syllogisms, the supremacies, lead to the conclusion that I should commit suicide, or I should die, or there's no point in, living, because life is suffering. I include my own existence in this life, so there's no point in living.
But it can mean that. It can mean that. But that's
philosophically and sophistically, to my understanding, it's in one way, there's no alternatives. Like, if you accept this as a foundational premise, you're bound to accept as non-negotiable the necessity of committing suicide. It's a necessity to commit suicide. It's not an option.
I understand. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't think that's what it means to be an anti-natalist, though. Basically, antinatalism to me, and I think to many antinatalists, is a rejection of DNA. Basically, like, we're caught up in this thing that just keeps on creating more people, more Benatars, more Amandas, more Georges, and we can see that people will exist in the future. So again, it's not necessarily about our existence right now, but the people that will exist, and preventing their suffering in the future if we can understand that we're suffering now. So it definitely makes what I would consider like the right to die more clear. I mean, once we become antinatalists, it definitely makes euthanasia a much more in focus part of piece of the premise, I suppose. But it's not really where antinatalists are driven. It's in the prevention of life.
Yes, well, there are always mild and harsher ways of reading philosophical theories, this especially political theories as well. That may be a milder way of reframing Bernardo's arguments, although they're, to my understanding, they're much more talkative and much more straight and much more vertical in terms of the interpretive scope. This is why I'm trying to consolidate his premises, his foundational premises, into 10, where, in order to show that it's clear, for example, when it says coming into existence is always a harm. So if, and always is italicized as well, and which means that he's placing a particular emphasis to this modifier This is an adverbial modifier which precludes any potential misinterpretation or the addition of any interpretations in a milder form. It's a more all-inclusive argument as regards the potential scope of its application. And this is why he's italicizing this adverbial premodifier. It is always a bad thing. It's always a harm. So if it's always a harm coming into existence, this should not be interpreted in temporal terms, that is, whether it is our existence now or some existence in the future. It refers to all existence regardless of its temporal situatedness. In this respect, I don't think that at least the original exposition of the philosophical theory leaves much scope for doubt as regards whether this is something that applies to future generations or this is something that applies to all human existence as of its inception.
Well, I think there are many antinatalists that would agree with you, and that's sort of led to a tertiary or tangential or related topic of promortalism, that antinatalism leads to promortalism, we should end our lives. And many antinatalists are promortalists, and some are very, very much not, and reject that entirely. It's sort of, the reaction that antinatalists most commonly receive to our philosophical position is, why don't you just go kill yourself? And the point, right? And the point that antinatalists make to that is that once you are alive, you have an interest in existing. You become addicted to living, essentially. Now, you can, as an individual, become unaddicted, and again, I believe everybody should have the right to end their own lives. But to be an antinatalist doesn't necessitate that, and it's not the focus of what antinatalists are trying to do. We're trying to prevent the existence of more life, not what we do with our own existence and our own pain. It can be, but it's not the true focus.
I'm just trying to point out that particular part in my article where I'm discussing this issue about a latent elitism. For example, where you say, if we accept this, then we should also accept that there are two groups of people. There are people who merit living. Of course, if we accept this premise, then we negate a foundational premise of anti-natalism. And there are people who merit becoming extinct. And this begs a further question, and it's definitely bound to lead to an infinite regression, against whose criteria you determine who belongs to which group. Because if it's not a matter to be decided by the first group, who are self-professed to come across as those who can pass decisions about who can live or who should live or who should die, and against which criteria, then there must be another group that must be responsible for conferring these judgments. So if this is the case, then it's bound to lead to an infinite regression. Which is the group and which are these people who can safeguard or deny existence. This is why there's and I found this quite to be a recurrent phenomenon in some of the comments that were posted in the Antinatalism community. Exactly what you said, that we believe, some of them believe that definitely some people do not marry procreating, or they should not live, but they live out themselves outside of the picture, which not what Bernardo did. So in a sense, they're suffused with an elitist sentiment, an elitist collective sentiment that legitimates them in a self-professed fashion to pass judgments about others by excluding themselves. And this is quite a recurrent phenomenon in the community, which of course has nothing to do with Bernardo, because Bernardo included himself in those who should never have been born, which again leads one-sidedly and in one-way fashion to the conclusion that you should cease to exist, because if you're not supposed to come into existence, and if your existence is harmful without any qualification, existence per se as such, then continuing to exist is pointless.
But I don't think that I mean, you do make a comment at one point in your paper that you were reacting to something that's a commenter had said about the difference between like misanthropic antinatalism and philanthropic antinatalism, and you made a comment saying that there wasn't, for Benatar, there wasn't all these variations of what an antinatalist can be, and that is incorrect as far as my understanding of Benatar goes. I mean, there is a real recognition that antinatalists can hold this. That antinatalism is in some respects very amorphous. In part because of another thing that you said, that yes, this doesn't exactly originate from Benatar. Antinatalism does have this very, very long history that doesn't even begin with Schopenhauer. It's an ancient idea, and people come to it naturally as well, even without any academia involved.
What I was trying to say is that in the community there were very clear vestiges of deviating from Benatar, as you correctly said.
Yeah.
And this is quite expectedly so, because all of these ideologies or this pseudo-philosophical system, because my understanding, this is pseudo-philosophy, it's an empirical philosophy which might as well, it's premised on abstractions upon abstraction upon abstraction, which is not really backed by data. For example, Bernardo is hardly ever using any data when he's backing his claims, or he's lapsing in all sorts of logical fallacies as regards slippery slopes, as regards the catapulting of singular examples into exemplars, which is the Derridian, what Derrida defines the problem of exemplarity, to what extent an example may exemplify the entire set of instances where it is instantiated, either as we know it by now, or counterfactually as it might have been instantiated in all possible worlds, and this may be extended ad infinitum as an argument. Bernardo is hardly ever drawing concrete examples, and when he does, he's using them in a rhetorical fashion, again by obliterating the dividing line between example and exemplar, in the same manner that popular media portray a singular social actor on the camera who confer their opinion about an event, and they're portraying this as the voice of the people, which is a typical logical fallacy, yet that is legitimated through the media portrayal of social cultural phenomena as a valid way of speaking. So there are all sorts of problems with Bernardo's exposition of his theory in terms of where he's coming from, but it's very clear that the way he's presenting it is in a very strict manner, and that any milder forms of putting forward his arguments would constitute deviations from Bernardo. Of course, it doesn't mean that you don't have the right to do this, but perhaps you should qualify this as a milder form of an antinatalism, so that everybody's in line. Again, this is a matter of appropriating, as I said, it's a matter of discursive strategy. The discursive strategy that's adopted by its social actor in terms of appropriating an ideology, making it one's own, cutting into one's own measures and then, presenting it in a manner that suits oneself. Because it's definitely, better to exclude oneself from this premise, from the premise that existence is not worthwhile, rather than and transposing it to somebody else, rather than making one part of this problem. But again, this deviates from definitely deviates from Benaror's original standpoint.
Out of curiosity, George, have you been in contact with Benatar at all? Do you know if he by chance has read your paper and had any thoughts about it? No.
Not at all. Not at all.
That would be very
Never.
interesting. I would really love to, hear what he thinks about that. That might be an interesting thing to have happen at some point.
As I said, the original purpose of my paper, at least this one, was not philosophical in essence.
Right, of course.
Although I might be, keen on writing another more philosophical oriented paper that is grappling with specific arguments, and there's quite extensive literature to that end, as far as I'm aware. The purpose of my paper was precisely to pinpoint these three strata of these three layers of transformation from philosophical system to ideology, and then to concrete empirical reality of the people who endorse this ideology in a fuzzy manner and who making it part of their daily existence, and quite a core part as well, and especially in a social medium like Facebook. So, the purpose of my paper was very, very specific, and the analysis were very narrowly oriented towards meeting these research objectives, rather than tackling in general the validity or the soundness of Benaror's philosophical system. This way, I only allocated one section in scrutinizing Benaror's philosophical system from a purely philosophical point of view, as well as opted for, putting all this material in that's addressing Benaror's system from a more macrocultural perspective as an appendix, rather than intermingling it with the core of my analysis.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very important point. That, the point of your paper was not a philosophical analysis. I hope that you do end up writing a detailed philosophical analysis. That'd be very interesting. Incidentally, I think you might be very interested in the paper on antinatalism that was written. Actually, I think he has two, but I think they're similar. I can't remember offhand. By Christopher Belshaw, because I think he would agree with you that Benatar implies pro-mortalism, and that might be an interesting thing to see you react to at some point. I know this may seem a bit tangential, but I do think it relates well to your research. Outside of Wikipedia, the word antinatalism is still not included or defined by any known dictionary in the world in any language. On top of that, the Wikipedia definition keeps on getting reworded and rephrased, which again, I think speaks volumes to your claim that antinatalists are constantly sort of negotiating the meaning of antinatalism. The first sentence of the Wikipedia definition used to be a philosophical position that assigns a negative value to birth. That was later changed to include a philosophical position and social movement that assigns a negative value to birth. But the social movement edition was extremely controversial and made a lot of antinatalists very angry. Many antinatalists do not like any insinuation that we are a social movement at all, which I'm curious to know your thoughts on, but let me just go on real quick. And now it seems the definition has changed entirely again to read antinatalism or anti-natalism is the ethical view that negatively values procreation. So George, I'm wondering how you feel personally how antinatalism should be defined, if you have any thoughts on this shifting definition that keeps happening. And also if you have any thoughts about the hesitance of some antinatalists to identify as a social movement.
Right. Well, first of all, as far as I can understand from what you said, the first and the third reframing are complementary aspects, because it is a moral system. Well, it's a moral philosophy. Strictly speaking, this monograph would fall under the discipline of moral philosophy. So it is an ethical system. So in this respect, the third definition, the third reframing, complements the first one quite neatly. I cannot see any dissonance in this respect. If the problem emerges between the first and the second definition, the second reframing, which is the addition of the social movement to the definition, and if this causes reactions and disgruntlement by some of the community members, then again this should might be negotiated by defining what what they mean by social movement. This is why I drew a distinction, which is quite customary distinction in cultural sociology, which is one of the disciplines that I drew for writing this paper and for demarcating what I mean by social movement. There's a major difference between traditional social movements and new social movements. And these differences I'm exploring and outlining in 5 main points, I think, as far as I remember in this paper. Let me quickly go through these differences because that might resolve some of these misunderstandings and some of these self-perceptions on behalf of anti-natalists. Now, from a cultural point of view, new social movements are concerned with fostering solidarity among members, the creation of collective identity, and the engagement in game-changing activism. However, new social movements are more lifestyle-oriented, encompassing people's everyday practices, tastes, consumption habits, leisure activities, modes of speech and dress, while reflecting and being ratified on lifestyle ideologies such as veganism, slow food, green living. Although such lifestyle-oriented new social movements do aim at challenging dominant cultural values and ideologies, usually they do not feature aspects that are definitive of political struggles, such as protests and aggressive forms of political activism. So perhaps the reason why people are reacting when their identity is accommodated under the rubric of a social movement is because they operate with a schema of a social movement as a challenging form against a dominant set of values, which perhaps is not something that they're sharing or that they endorse. They endorse themselves as more of a lifestyle ideology, perhaps a passing time fancy, or not as being as integral to their existence as the original exposition of philosophical movement says. And again, the difference between a new social movement and a traditional social movement concerns eligibility criteria. In traditional social movements will probably be screened by the head of a movement or someone who's appointed to a position of screening in order to recruit, the movement member. Whereas in new social movements, especially social movements, you can easily opt in and opt out of the community with a single click. Yeah, you can join in and join out. So the affiliations that are created between the community members are not as strict as the traditional concept of social movement resonates. So I can see to what extent when and in certain aspects, there's definitely an issue with big data analytics and the way profiling is practiced by social media when they're trying to impose specific labels on you based on your surfing habits or your shares and clicks, which may be as fancy as ephemeral and not at all as being reflective of either latent personality traits or of very well thought out actions. It's passing time. It's like famous Facebook friends. Everybody knows that all these 3 people that you have as friends on your Facebook page, most likely you don't know, and you've never met 2,999 of them. Perhaps one, your mom, or whatever, but not the rest. So it's exactly the same with big data analytics. It's a massive fallacy. Not only it's unethical, That's a very tip of the iceberg. The ethical part is absolutely fallacious and ridiculous. It's ludicrous, and I'm not really sure whether we should be even talking about it, not practicing it. Like actually legitimating this sort of analytics for conferring, for profiling purposes. So yes, by the same token, people should have a right to react to being labeled as something that they not fully endorse or they don't fully understand, but which they might be drawn into in the same fashion they would be drawn situationally to a clubbing event or to any sort of event. I mean, you have every right to consider. That's what I keep saying. There's a compulsion to confess, a ubiquitous compulsion to confess, and an identificatory logic that have been taking root over the public mores over the past 2 decades, which have nothing to do with any possible precedent as regards theories of selfhood and how they have been expressed in different disciplines, from philosophy to sociology to political theory. The simplest example is, difference between a core self and a situational self. And it's like claiming that because you're going to swear somebody who's invading your property, you're a swearing person. It's that sort of fallacies and paralogisms to which this confessional culture is leading to. So by the same token, people, are starting to react because this sort of, let's say, representational silos and this representational death camping is suffocating them. So, you don't have the right to label me as an anti-natalist because, yes, I may agree with some part of it, but, I'm not really that, committed, or it's not a cause because it's not a traditional social movement, for example, a political movement. They don't conceptualize it as a cause-related social movement. It's more like, a way of expressing along others who may sharing in the same fuzzy schematic fashion some of the problems that they have been encountering with a more, let's say, a more mundane way of rendering a philosophical system, which of course has completely different orientation and premises. So to my understanding, they should rather omit the term social movement,
Interesting. Okay.
but perhaps rephrase it as a new social movement in order to reflect this, let's say, very nuanced differentiation between what it meant to be a social movement, let's say, during the industrialization era, and what it has come to connote and designate in a post-industrialized, postmodern, fast food ideological predicament.
Fascinating thoughts all around. Thank you so much for that, George. I mean, related to one of the quotes from your paper that I was quite drawn to is, moreover, the antinatalist community per se is more akin to an affective and imaginary one. Some might be surprised to hear that I actually do agree with you there. I don't think that remains entirely true today, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on this. But at the time the paper was written, let's say 2017, 2019, I do think you were very correct. Your paper, I think, was written at a very interesting time in the development of the antinatalist community, because later that same year, 2019, antinatalist activism actually started to leave the barriers of social media and the internet, and you saw the arrival of things more akin to traditional activism, like street outreach, meetups, and even the formation of I don't know, like, let's call them proto NGOs, stuff like Child Free India, Stop Having Kids, which came a little later, Antinatalism International, which is my collective, and the AAJP, which is the Association of Anti-Procreationalism in Japan. What are your thoughts, if on this evolution in antinatalism, if we can call it that? And in your mind, does this make the antinatalist community more real, so to speak, less imaginary?
Yeah. Right. Well, it's not going to get less imaginary if people stretch the logical outcomes of these basic premises to their farthest extremes,
Okay.
which is what it sounds like the way you're describing it. As I said, committing suicide or killing anyone, including oneself, is perfectly legitimated based on the basic premises of this system. This is very clear to my understanding. There's no point in arguing that if you endorse it and if this philosophical system becomes legitimated, you have every right to kill anyone else, including yourself. It's very clear. So, whatever, let's say, movement or ramification develops from these premises is a typical way of extending a philosophical string of syllogisms to the farthest extremes. It's neither the first nor the last, instance where such an extension takes place, and it's very usual in terms of legitimating, especially ethical theories, to be stretching premises to the farthest extremes. For example, Habermas' ethical system, which is an attempt to salvage Kantian rationalism, where reason presides as the ultimate court of appeal over every instance of empirical reality, and to transpose this kind of transcendental function of reason in a communitarian setting of reasonable subjects, which is a completely different thing, because when you transpose a disinterested notion of reason to a naturally pragmatic dimension that has to do with how different subjects define their rationality in an instrumentalist fashion within a communitarian setting, then you can get all sorts of legitimations of rationality, including, for example, whoever doesn't use aromatic garbage bags should not be a member of our community. And this is definitely a rational decision because it has been made within the communitarian settings of us who preside over, this community as reasonable and rational social actors. You see these sorts of transpositions, which are definitely legitimate from a philosophical point of view, yet, they tend to, at their very extremes, they tend to be tinged with all sorts of ludicrous and fanciful statements, decisions, and concrete manifestations.
I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. I'm not sure how best to proceed with going forward with you detailing your findings of this study, but I'm very interested in hearing about that. Yeah.
Well, we talked about discourse strategies, I think to some extent, which is, as I said, the nodal point between transforming ideology into an individuated empirical reality. Now, the third finding in my research, which I think is equally important, and it's actually it actually confirms the latent hypothesis that I developed during the initial stages of the research, that is the fact that the collective identity of a new social movement is more a case of emotive effervescence rather than a very rational process of argumentation about the basic premises of an ideology and its underlying philosophy. This came through very, very vividly while analyzing the posts, the comments that were sent, and the interaction among the members of the Anti-natalist community on Facebook. For example, when people, some of the comments that stood out concern misanthropy. And in this case, it said, some commentators, as I'm writing, appear to be effective as schism in the seamless fabric of the ideology by adopting not only a milder anti-natalist stance, but also by negating the underlying idea altogether, which is a more advanced stage compared to what we have been discussing earlier. And I quote, depends, and this is a verbatim quotation from one of the participants, depends on the anti-natalist branch. Misanthropic, sure, I guess, but most antinatalists assign a negative value to birth due to compassion, so they want to help others. So again, it's a way of providing a nuance that fits one's worldview that may not have been necessarily, and definitely has not been, part of the initial philosophical system. Because when Bernardo said, developed this absolute sentence that is always harmful, then this always, this pre-modifier, does not leave a great scope or interpretive space for maneuvering as regards providing more nuanced interpretations, whether it's because you're compassionate towards other, or because you're a misanthropic and don't like others. So you see, it's a way of negotiating the original philosophy and trying to bring it to the level of one's own latent axiology, which is not necessarily in line with the philosophy. And that's the mediating. This is where ideology comes into place, and this is where the philosophy becomes transformed into an ideology that is a set of fuzzy schemata and fuzzy premises which inform and become malleably manipulated by others in ways that definitely may not have been intended in the original philosophical exposition. I think this is the major finding from this empirical research, the fact that because people are talking about ideologies all the time, and what is your ideology or what is your philosophy, and so on and so forth. It's very important to understand through a systematic reading of sociocultural phenomena, and this is what is afforded by discourse analysis and semiotics in many respects, and of course by using specific methodological avenues, academically credible, valid, and reliable, and software like Atlas TR or in vivo, where you can we have the ability to quantify data rather than point out qualitatively some aspects of it. It comes forth very concretely and very reliably, so that these communities are edified or on a public sentiment that is driven through effervescence. It's exactly the same effect as ordinary chit chat, which Heidegger tagged as inauthentic, as mid-design, as being among us. It's always it's a way of attesting to the relational value of communication rather than trying to affirm or not the truth value behind locutions. And this relational turn to communication has been prevalent over the past 30 years. I reached the same conclusion in the paper that I wrote about the ice bucket challenge. Again, it's a very vivid way of exemplifying the sheerly relational value of communication, because there is absolutely no verbal content, no argumentation. It's just an emulation and a viral passing over of a specific sketch that is capable of drawing strong bonds between politicians, between famous personas, and which means that it is this mode of communicated is legitimated because it is enacted by intermediaries of cultural production. And in the same fashion, the more popular personas are adopting anti-natalism. For example, Robert Smith of The Cure was an example of a famous artist who has endorsed anti-natalism. It's a way of, let's say, legitimating informally a philosophical perspective, yet which is taking root in a much fuzzier manner than was originally intended. I think that's the major takeout, and it's very important for appreciating the value of social sciences and academic research in general, against a broader audience, because it's otherwise you don't have a way of accounting for all these concrete manifestations. You just adopt what you see critically. So it's a matter of cultivating self-awareness and become self more critical about what you see around you, as a plain person who's not necessarily a social researcher or a scientist, about how to analyze phenomena and how to become more self-aware about what you're subscribing to. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating, George. Thank you so much for that. Are you still a part of this Facebook group? Since you wrote your paper, do you continue to follow it? And if so, do you have any thoughts on how it's changed since that time, if at all?
No, I opted out as soon as I finished my research, because the only way I subscribed was in order to try to understand exactly this difference between philosophy and ideology, and us negotiating between members. As I said, I'm the only I was drawn into it in the same manner that I have been attracted to other social cultural phenomena from a point of view of my ongoing academic research.
Right, of course. Has the paper received any feedback from the antinatalist community that you can talk about? You have said in earlier in this interview that it has received a lot of attention outside of the community, which is very interesting.
Well, a lot. Well, in proportion to a lot in proportion to how much research it has attracted from academic researchers, not in absolute numbers, but I'm not aware of how and if it has been read by actual antinatalists or members of this community, and what the feedback might be. But again, this is a major issue as regards the way you analyze and you represent a social cultural phenomenon, and to what extent the actual participants may agree or disagree. There is a strand of academic researchers who say that they're more affiliated with a realist, with a social realist camp, who say that if the actual participants do not agree with your analysis, that it's not a valid analysis. I completely disagree with this approach, 100%. And it's just like saying that you're a physicist or a chemist, and your perception of how this compound works should be the same as a layperson's. Not at all. I don't have a clue about physics, to be honest, and my knowledge of how a phenomenon works otherwise in any other manner than I perceive it intuitively has nothing to do with the scientific approach that may be applied by a researcher.
100% agree. I mean, you spoke a little bit about perhaps at some point wanting to revisit the philosophy itself, and perhaps writing another paper about the philosophy. Do you have any inclination on continuing this research at some point in time?
Well, not at this point, unless of course somebody approached me with a generous offer, which I might be inclined to accept. But as it goes, self-motivated inclination to continue delving into this phenomenon, not at this stage. I mean, I have a very busy pipeline, which of course includes other social cultural phenomena as well. This definitely does not deny the sheer interest and as you said, the transmutations of this philosophy and its ideological ramifications and its empirical ramifications as well, which have been evolving in quite a extreme and accentuated directions. But again, cannot tackle everything. I'm a finite being and I have two hands. Still, thankfully, I might have one, but you never know. Anyways, yes, and that's not part of my short-term intention.
Yeah, no, you're a very busy man. So many projects, and which it's really quite extraordinary. It's been a pleasure to go through your repertoire. I haven't got a chance to read everything, of course, but yes, you're very prolific. You've spoken a little piece of this already, but I mean, what are your future plans? What are some of what you're working on right now? What can we expect, and how can people
Um,
find you and continue to support your work?
right now, short term, I'm preparing for a syllabus that I'll be delivering here in Athens between February and May on branding, brand equity, and integrated marketing communications. It's more a typical, a marketing course, not very social and scientific oriented, in affiliation with the University of West London, which is represented by a local college. And this is something that one of the projects I'm working right now. It's getting absorbing a lot of my time. At the same time, I'm trying to finish the editing of the forthcoming book, the collective volume, with the participation of prominent discourse analysts and semioticians from all over the world. That is called Advances in Brand Semiotics and Discourse Analysis. Hopefully, it will be published towards the end by Vernon Press. We have a contract. It's a very nice team, and I will be glad to discuss with you some of the contents
I'd
if
love
they
that.
compete with any of your interests, current or future. So yes, these are the two major projects, and of course, I'm continuing the editing the International Journal of Market Semiotics and Discourse Analysis. We have a lot of submissions, and we're trying to present a lot of new areas of research in the interdisciplinary research between marketing, semiotics, and discourse analysis. The good news about marketing is that it also has a social mission. There is a strand that's called transformative marketing and the critical marketing and cultural consumer research, from my perspective, adopts a pan-consumptivist approach. This is why we're not talking about just about consuming products or services, but also about ideologies as well. Consumer ideologies is a major part in cultural sociology and in cross-pollination with marketing theory and practice. It may lead to very useful areas both for policymakers, but as I said, first and foremost, for all of us as ordinary consumers of ideologies and belief systems in our everyday existence. This is a very important and fruitful way of becoming self-aware and self-knowledgeable on what we have been indoctrinated into, what kind of beliefs we have, latent in our brains, hardwired in our brains, and how we can become more critical, perhaps, about them in an attempt to, let's say, find something that it's more closer to what we're looking for, what we're aiming at, and hopefully we don't have to die on the way to epiphany. So
Well
yes,
said.
that's it from me for today's session. Amanda, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me in this fabulous podcast that you're managing. And you have been doing a great work up until now. I watched some of your previous episodes with your guests, which were of great interest, and I wish you all the best going forward. And I will be here if you need me again. I'll be more than glad to share my opinions and hopefully more informed ways of addressing some of these issues.
Wonderful, George. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor speaking with you today. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. I really, whatever disagreements we may have about this or that, philosophically, I mean, I think you have given the antinatalist community an absolutely indispensably important research into what we are and how we're behaving, and how we're existing. And it's really been incredible to hear your thoughts on everything. So once again, just thank you so much for your time today. And this
Excellent.
has really been wonderful. Thank you again.
Great.
Please see the links below to find both versions of Mr. Rossolatos' paper on antinatalism, as well as many other links where you can find his other projects and essays. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. This has been Amanda Oldfan-Sukanik. You can find me on the YouTube channel Anti-Natal Wolf. Keep up with my daily antinatalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. You can also listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, RSS feed, Amazon.com, and so many other platforms. You can email me at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com, website designed by Visions Noirs. Please follow Visions Noirs at www.bionoir.com and also follow him on Instagram. Logo art by the incredible Life Sucks. Please subscribe to him on YouTube, and if you would like to perhaps check out his merch, including Exploring Antinatalism podcast t-shirts, you can go check out his Etsy page at www.etsy.com/shop/lifesuckspublishing. Music was written by the amazing I Doubt It. Please subscribe to him on YouTube and check out our collaborative project along with our dear friend EFIL WV, The Right to No Longer Exist, which includes the podcast, The Right to No Longer Exist, a Right to Die podcast. All the best, and bye for now.